Hello, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us during this severe thunderstorm warning, or whatever it is, here in Washington, D.C. And more to the point, thank you for joining us on the night of the NFL season opener. I'm contractually obligated to say go Lions. But thank you again for joining us tonight as we come to honor the legacy of Dr. William and Connie Marshner. Glancing at Bill's, if I may be so bold, CV here, I'm reminded of an anecdote from my confirmation sponsor, who was the head of the English department at my university, who was very involved in prison ministry. And he would have these long, drawn-out philosophical conversations with the men who were incarcerated. He was helping get their GED and maybe go to confession occasionally. And there was one guy who was very fond of really carrying these arguments, as far as they would go from first premises. And he said to Ray Ventry, my sponsor at one point, "How come you're always right?" And he said, "Well, what's your name?" And he said, "Tom Miller, ZX2CVB, Tom Miller." And he said, "What's my name?" And he said, "Ray Ventry, PhD." And he said, "Well, it's because you have letters, you have numbers in front of your name, and I have letters after mine." So, without further ado, Bill Marshner, I hope we could honor with a short round of applause here. Bill Marshner, MASTL, STD, is Professor Emeritus of Theology at Christendom College, which he helped to found and where he served for 38 years as professor. He is the author, editor, and translator of many articles and books, most recently a translation of Cardinal Cajetan's commentary on the Summa, forthcoming from CUA Press. Dr. Marshner was born in Baltimore, the second greatest city in America, and attended Gettysburg College on a scholarship from his Lutheran synod because he was on track to becoming a Lutheran minister. He won a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship to study ancient Near Eastern languages and literature at Yale. But while he was working as a night watchman in Sterling Library, he did something very dangerous. He discovered Thomas Aquinas. And that was the end of his Lutheran career. Mind you, this was in 1969. And when he went to the local Catholic parish to join the church, the pastor said to him, "Why do you want to join the church? Everybody else is leaving." Later, he completed his MA at the University of Dallas and his STL and STD at the John Paul II Institute of the Pontifical Lateran University. Before becoming an academic, he was an editor of Triumph, the, I dare say, radical Catholic magazine of the 1960s and 70s, founded by L. Brent Bazell Jr., and later a contributing editor to The Wanderer, the traditionalist Catholic newspaper from 1972 to 1975. When Christendom College started up in 1976, he was the founding faculty member for theology and philosophy. Along the way, he moonlighted as editor of Human Life Reports, published by Human Life International, and for Paul Weyrich's Free Congress Foundation. He co-authored the foundational work in cultural conservatism with William Lind, and he's a past president, perhaps, in my opinion, his greatest distinction of the Mariological Society of America. Anyway, his other books include Defending the Faith, an anti-modernist anthology, also published by CUA Press. It's a wonderful, if you haven't seen it, it's still in print. It's a wonderful collection of translations of the very first critics of modernism from the end of the 19th century on. very unjustly neglected. And from the first, they cut the whole things to ribbons. Connacht, which I only realized was her first name 6 hours ago, Connie Marshner, worked for many years to bring Christian influence to bear on public policy. She was on the founding staff of the Heritage Foundation and founded the Family Protection Report and the Child and Family Protection Institute of the Free Congress Foundation, eventually becoming executive vice president. She was partner with Paul Weyrich in helping to found the Religious Right in the late 1970s. In 1980, she was chair of the Family Policy Advisory Board of the Reagan-Bush campaign and of the National Pro-Family Coalition. She's the author of numerous articles and books, including Blackboard Tyranny, Decent Exposure, How to Teach Your Children About Sex, A Guide to Education and the Virtues, and Can Motherhood Survive, A Critique of Social Parenting. She was editor of Blueprint for Education Reform and of other works. Currently, she's president of the Saints and Scholars Foundation, which helps to support independent faithful Catholic education in Ireland. Somebody please ask her a question about that so she can explain why this is much needed. In addition to many other things, she's also running for town council in Front Royal this November. So without making this a campaign endorsement for any of you who are in that jurisdiction, please consider getting the sticker. If I might add to Connie's CV here, I would say, with all apologies to Dr. Marshner, my single favorite piece of writing in the extended Marshner corpus is a wonderful reflection that Connie wrote a few years ago for Alatea on Wagner and the Sacrament of Confession. Not two things that one would immediately associate, but when you see it, you can never unsee it. Bill and Connie have been married 50 years this October, which I think calls for another round of applause. And they have 11 grandchildren. So with that, to turn it over to our honorees tonight, we'll start with Dr. Marshner. So Dr. Marshner, you grew up Lutheran and became Catholic at Yale in 1969. Can you tell us about what that experience was like?
Well, as your comment has already made clear, it was a movement against the tide. Yale, of course, was no friend to the Catholic Church, but they did have some beautiful faculty members and a beautiful library. The Sterling Library became my home away from home. And I worked there on a fairly well nightly basis and took up reading of things. The reading that started my way into the church, however, was not Aquinas. It was John Henry Newman's book on justification. And I don't know what else to tell you about that. Growing up Lutheran, of course, was a great bore. But in my day, there was a high-powered, high school age evangelical group. And it was called Youth for Christ. And I became a great fan of it. I joined it and even wrote the date of my rebirth in my Bible. That wasn't the right date. But it was a date of what we call in the Catholic Church spiritual conversion. Let me see. Is there anything else I need to say at this point? I think not.
So what was the path from becoming Catholic to joining the staff of Triumph? And when you look back on the magazine's run, a magazine that, by the way, is, to Catholics of my generation, has been very influential.
Good.
Where do you think you were right, and where, if anywhere, have you changed your mind?
Well, we were right about the point that the American polity desperately needs the wisdom of the Catholic Church. It desperately needs our account of natural law and a firm morality. Without those things, this nation will continue to fall apart, as it has been doing with such regularity for at least the past 3 years. And what we got wrong was basically very simple. We completely underestimated the degree to which the church was rotted from within by liberalism. Okay? It was, well, in the 60s, but already starting in the 50s, it was the era in the church of pro-Americanism. I don't mean the name of the heresy, although that would do too, but the name of the country. The Bill of Rights was considered a vast improvement over the Catholic tradition, which I disagree with, by the way. But that was an era when the Catholic people were being taught and themselves striving to conform to the American ideal. Many had been immigrants, and of course they wanted to fit in to their new society. That's understandable. But unfortunately, they didn't realize what a treasure of wisdom they had to share with the American people. And we thought that treasure was still in Catholic minds in this country in great numbers, and we could stir it up into some self-consciousness. But that was not true. So we failed miserably.
So on that optimistic note, something for which you were also sort of present at the birth was what we would now think of as the pro-life movement. What did the anti-abortion movement in this country get right, and where has it erred, or I dare say failed?
I may have something to say about that, but I'm going to defer first to my missus, who is extremely active with Right to Life work.
Thank you, sir. Yes, for about a dozen years, I chaired a meeting that you never heard of, and that was by intention. A quarterly meeting of the CEOs and the COOs of about 70 different pro-life organizations. At the beginning, when we first started meeting, these organizations had lawsuits against each other, and by the end, they were all pretty well getting along. But so I've been deeply involved from the beginning. What the pro-life movement got right was it became the pro-life movement, not the anti-abortion movement. And what it got wrong at the very beginning for the first 20 years was its charming habit of forming circular firing squads and condemning each other, fighting with each other, and not moving toward a common objective. Something it got very right was realizing that the woman is a crucial part of the picture. It wasn't about killing babies, and that's wrong, but when the movement began to focus on women and what a woman with an unwanted, unplanned pregnancy was actually experiencing, then they began to learn how to communicate with women. The research of Charlie Kenny had a lot to do with that. Another thing the pro-life movement got very right was it was ecumenical. Not initially, but once it figured out that it's okay to say Hail Marys, but let's not force all these good Protestant ladies to say the whole rosary. And it reached out and it brought in the evangelical movement. That was a huge right thing to do. And in fact, I think the pro-life movement has been the best example of ecumenism that there possibly could be. A lot of people who came in to the pro-life movement returned to their Catholic roots, and a lot of them converted to for the first time. So that the pro-life movement got right. The pro-life movement got right realizing that in order to change, realizing eventually the difference between influence and power. Influence is when people, and I'm speaking here of voting members of legislatures, and when they say, oh, yes, I'll give you an appointment, I'll talk to you, that you get enough influence, you get the appointment. Power is when you say, we want you to vote this way on this issue, and they do it. And it took the pro-life movement a while to get there. I hope it's still there. There was a period of time when it was there, but that requires grassroots, a lot of grassroots organization and discipline, and that was right. It was also, I think, at the time, I think it was right to align with one party. Maybe the time now to back off from that and to broaden the base, but that was at the time a good strategy, or I should say tactic, because it moved things forward. I'll stop there and let you add your 10 cents.
I don't think I have 10 cents worth to add, but I will remark that the pro-life movement did not make the mistake of trying to make the Catholic dogma on the unborn and their protection the purpose of their campaign. The purpose of the campaign was to provide some protection under American law, as much as we could manage. That was crucial. Otherwise, we would have been crucified from the beginning with people screaming that we wanted to seize their contraceptive pills. Well, I would be happy to seize them, but that was not the point of the movement. And so the pro-life movement did well to avoid confusion with those other issues. I'll let it go there.
So to turn on a dime from the practical to the speculative, the primacy of which has been rightly asserted by better men than me. Dr. Marshner, what drew you to Cajetan, and what does Cajetan have to tell us about St. Thomas that would be lost otherwise?
You would do better to ask Leo XIII. When he approved the huge work of making a critical edition of all the works of St. Thomas, the work of the commission started with the Summa, and the Pope commanded that Cajetan's commentaries on each article be published along with the articles themselves. Therein he was following and endorsing a long tradition within the Dominican order of studying the Summa article by article with Cajetan's commentaries. Now then, when I was looking around for some help becoming a Thomist, I found that it was impossible to study Cajetan. It wasn't offered. Now, I'm sure it was different in a Dominican house, but I wasn't in a Dominican house. I was at Yale, and the going wisdom when I was a youth was that Cajetan had been a terrible bane. He had misconceived Aquinas' spirit and had commented very badly indeed on the Summa. Previous generations of Dominicans had always maintained that he was the most reliable, most brilliant, and important commentator. There were other good ones, but Cajetan was the best. I decided to see for myself. So I got hold of a 1517 edition of Cajetan's commentary. It ran all around the borders of the page. In the center of the page was an article and so on. And all around the borders ran this commentary. I decided to read it. And I was enthralled. For one thing, you find out the exactitude and subtlety of St. Thomas's thought. You need to know, for example, what he meant by the ratio of something. Okay? What did he mean by that? Well, it turns out he meant a scientific account. What Aristotle would have meant by the logos of something. And that is quite different from the sense of the word. The ratio of something is not what you'll find in a dictionary, unless it's a very unusual dictionary. But it is something extremely important to know, and Cajetan had it right. Now, if you don't know how to translate the ratio of blank, you simply can't translate Cajetan, which may be a part of the reason why it had been so seldom done. Imagine my astonishment when I was told that there was no translation of Cajetan in any modern European language, not even in Italian. Well, I suppose the Italians trusted their clergy better than we had a right to trust ours, because the abandonment of Latin wholesale by the clergy was a great blow to the church. So I decided there's nothing to do but translate it. I thought I would add the translation of those commentaries to one of the going editions of the Summa. Turned out to be undoable. Couldn't be done because the modern translations are either inaccurate or too folksy. Those that read well as English ignore important technical details. So I decided to start again, and the result is being published very soon by the Catholic University Press here. Go ahead.
So, you mentioned the wholesale or almost wholesale abandonment of Latin by the church, and that reminds me that You are not, I believe, a Latin Rite Catholic.
Yep.
How did a good Lutheran boy who almost became a pastor enter the church in 1969 and not endure the penance of the transitional missal and then what followed in 1970?
You said it yourself. Putting up with the so-called liturgical reform is a penance. And at some point, I just began to be unable to take it anymore. At one time, I was going off to a monastery where things were celebrated still in Latin. It was a long drive away, but I was willing to do it. But as far as the institutions here in the District of Columbia are concerned, it was a wipeout at the time. There are oases of healing now. But I used to be a regular communicant at St. Matthew's Cathedral, where there was a wonderful choir. Well, that choir was abolished, and the old Mass was eliminated, and the mischief of Paul VI was instituted instead. And I simply was not willing to put up with it. This is not the worship of God as a gentleman would perform it.
So, while we're on the complaining note, one thing I had actually marked here under complaints, rightly, reasonably directed complaints, about historical, critical, biblical scholarship are very widespread. You might call them the Father Brown stories after Raymond Brown, that attitude towards sacred scripture. What is the right path, and how do we get away from this? What does the church offer, could the church offer to take us back?
What the church mainly offers is the apostolic tradition. Harnack made the remark that besides the 4 written Gospels, we have a 5th, which in some ways is more impressive than the other 4. It is the witness of the early church to the faith of the people in Christ as the Son of God, as risen from the dead, as virginally conceived, and all the rest. That is not the sort of remark you would expect from Harnack, but it was very just. And what the Catholic Church provides her exegetes, if they're interested in looking at it, is a path into the apostolic tradition, which isn't just words, it's also institutions. The church itself was handed to us by the apostles. And the spirit of the liturgy and the exact sense of where the moral life comes in and where the supernatural life after baptism begins, what it completes. If you follow the apostolic tradition, you will be led to Ignatius of Antioch. And if you are impressed and led by Ignatius of Antioch, you will never be a modernist. You will never follow Bultmann, in my opinion. I wouldn't want anyone to follow Bultmann in any case. But this is the main thing the Catholic Church has to offer. It's not as though the Church has recently developed important doctrinal clarifications about the business of exegesis. To the best of my knowledge, it has not. Recent stuff from the magisterium is not all that good.
Is the Nova Vulgata the Bible?
Beg pardon?
Is the Nova Vulgata the Bible, or is it just a pastiche of various, or sat scriptures, in a version of Latin? Were we wrong to move on from the Clementine Vulgate?
Well, I don't know what you mean by the Vulgate, but if you mean the Latin translation, remember there's the old Itala, and the church used the Psalms from the old Itala liturgy in her Psalter. This was true before Jerome did his important work. And but what you need to understand is the degree to which there was a consensus in the early church which shatters the idea that, well, for the first 30 years, the church just thought Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, and then he sort of got a promotion to be divine, and then he died for our sins, and so on and so on, just adding piece after piece in post-apostolic times. No, not at all.
So of a piece with this very much is, around the time that you started reading St. Thomas in the Sterling Library, the church's theologians, including theologians who were or would become princes of the church, were interested in almost everything except Thomas. They were interested in Bultmann, as you say. They were interested in trying to do phenomenological theology, or trying to do theology with Heidegger, or whatever the case may be. And to some extent, I think if you look at the basic idiom of magisterial documents in the last half century and beyond, you can see from the top down a basic transformation of the kind of default grammar of the faith. Do you think that churchmen having recourse to something other than Thomism has been a positive development?
Well, of course. No decent Catholic education was ever limited to Aquinas. For heaven's sake, you can't understand even what Aquinas was up to without having seen the work on gathering the opinions of the fathers in Peter Lombard. So you had to know the 4 books of the Sententiarum. And that unified the scholastic project with the patristic project. And in the absence of that, many aspects of scholasticism are unintelligible. But it's important to return to the study of the Fathers. That was something that the Nouvelle Theologie had right. But the Fathers understood how. In accordance with the great tradition, or on some fancy new hypothetical basis. Well, I can't get into all the details. In fact, I can't get into any of them at this point. But it would be worth a lecture. to talk just about the works of the fathers, which we now date to the 1st century.
So to move from the 1st century to the end of the 20th, Connie, so you were one of the founding staffers at the Heritage Foundation, executive vice president of the Free Congress Foundation. And by the time you left, probably one of the most influential women in what was then called the New Right. How do you look back on your time in this city here, Washington, D.C.?
Well, it was a different city. It was a different universe. I mean, at the time the Heritage Foundation was founded, and any of you who've been to the building down there on Massachusetts Avenue will find this hard to believe, there were 5 people on the staff. So I was the one who picked out the phone number, which they still have. We were a brand new idea. Paul Weyrich was the visionary, and he got it going. He was a very interesting man. I have written a biography of his, which is still in search of a publisher. He was actually, let me just take a little side trip here, because he was the product of a Dominican Catholic education in Racine, Wisconsin, through 12th grade. I mean, he's the poster child for how the Catholic education system in America was supposed to work. And he was a good student, of course, and he took it very seriously, and it never left him. And it guided his thinking. And he got into politics because he wanted to make it possible for people to save their souls. And he could tell the way the country was going, that was going to be impossible one way or another. So he founded the Heritage Foundation in order to be an organization, and I know you're going to find this hard to believe, any of you who've worked on Capitol Hill, to provide a point of view on upcoming legislation that the legislators would not have heard, and to have it on their desk before the vote. I mean, we're talking, 1972 or 3? And there were there was no pressure group on the right. There were a lot of them on the left, but not anywhere near what there are now. And staff members, House members who were conservative, didn't talk to each other. Senate didn't talk to each other. The conservatives in the House never talked to the conservatives in the Senate. It was, as a result, I mean, it's now looked back on as, oh, wasn't that a wonderful era of bipartisanship? Yeah, it was, because there were more Democrats than Republicans, and everybody got along. But nobody ever questioned the agenda that was being put forward by the Democrats. And if they did, they were a voice in the wilderness. There was one conservative newspaper, Human Events. There were a few columnists around the country who would occasionally write columns, but that was it. There was no conservative voice. So when Weyrich started that, there was one other think tank. There was a free market think tank in town, but they made sure that their studies arrived after the vote because they had been harassed by the IRS. So they made sure that their studies arrived after the vote. So that was the unique thing about Heritage, was that it tackled the issues of the day, from in time to make a difference. Unfortunately, the support of the Heritage in those days was really dead set against social issues. So when Roe v. Wade came down, and Heritage Board would not, at the time, would not allow anybody to say anything about it, Paul went and founded the Committee for Survival of a Free Congress, which was the first conservative political action committee. That animal had just been created by the post-Watergate reforms. And so he set about instead electing pro-lifers. And by doing that, he grafted the pro-life issue onto the Republican agenda because he knew how to win elections because he'd grown up in a blue-collar area in Wisconsin, so he knew how labor unions did it. He just brought that technology to the right, and the Republican Party began to win elections, even though the establishment, which at that time, you got to remember, that was controlled by Nelson Rockefeller, major funder of Planned Parenthood and world population, et cetera. So that's how he got the pro-life movement grafted with the Republican Party. I think I have diverged from your question. What was the actual, was it good or bad? What was it you were asking?
Oh, it was just how do you look back on your time in Washington? But I
didn't mean to give a lecture.
no.
How exciting. It was thrilling to be one of, the 50 or 100 people at the first March for Life. It was very heady. It was heady days because you actually could see a difference being made. And so it's a very pleasant memory. And one of the things that we did was we got, anyhow, you go ahead and ask a question.
So in 1982, you wrote a monograph titled "The New Traditional Woman," seeking to address the sort of position of modern women, working outside the home with traditional values. Was that a call for a new women's movement? And what would you say to women who find themselves not necessarily sympathetic with feminism and what's called women's politics today?
Well, that wasn't a call so much for anything new as guidance to women with traditional values who found themselves in the new world in which a second income was suddenly becoming indispensable. And that changed everything for women. After, in what was it, 1976 maybe, Congress passed a whole series, under the pressure from the feminist movement, passed a whole series of legislation aimed at, making women equal. And one of those bills had to do with how mortgages were decided. And when we left Washington to go to graduate school in Texas, there were some townhouses that had just gone up, and they were selling for $7,000 or $8,000. And when we came back 2 years later, they were selling for $20,000. And what happened overnight was that all of a sudden there were twice as many dollars chasing the same number of houses. And that was because previous to that legislation, if a married woman, said, I don't intend to keep working after we buy this house or in order to qualify for this mortgage, the mortgage company would count the husband's income and decide how much they could afford. But after that, even if the woman came in 9 months pregnant saying, I'm quitting my job, they had to count her income. And so what the effect of that was that it allowed sellers to double the price of their houses. And that, that's kind of just one graphic example of how feminism really hurt women, because that was supposed to help women. But so that was the new traditional woman. A more important monograph was Why the Family Matters. Did you?
Yeah, I was actually just going to ask you about that as a kind of follow-up a year later. Tell us, why does the family matter?
Well, what I was trying to do with that monograph was convince the business community why they should pay attention to what was going on with the family, why it mattered to business if at that point it was something like 3 out of 10 children were born out of wedlock. Now it's something like 7 out of 10 are born out of wedlock. Why it mattered if the divorce rate was as high as it was and going higher. Why it mattered to business. Because by that point, by the 90s, it was clear that the social conservatives were the Christian right, the new right, were the social conservatives, but the money was saying, don't like those social issues. Leave those alone. We care about economics, the free market, free trade, national defense. Okay, I'm on with that. And protecting the Constitution. But they didn't want to deal with social issues because they didn't think it mattered to business. And that was my attempt to try to make that connection. I'm sorry I wasn't able to be more effective at making that connection. Because
I was just going to say is that tension, I think, is still evident today, right?
Less so than then. I mean, for instance, the Heritage Foundation, which of course today is humongous, they have a very active domestic policy division, and they get involved in things like library fights and school board issues and so forth. So they are engaged now in culture issues. But the libertarians have gone further libertarian, and that's so it hasn't been totally successful. But it was a conversation I tried to start back then. Had we had the expertise and the funding, it might have gone better.
So now, looking back on all of this, both of you having these varied and fascinating and fruitful careers, how do you, especially if I ask almost from a personal perspective as a parent of 4, aged 8 and younger, how did you guys balance all of this stuff with family life?
You go first.
I'm not sure I understand the question. We stayed married. And we were careful about raising our children. At one time, we had the television locked away in a closet. Okay? That electrical monster was not going to raise our children. And, well, it came out of the closet after a while, but for a number of crucial years, it was forbidden. And some of our efforts were simply unsuccessful, but we tried them anyway. I tried to interest my children in classical music. They were, of course, suckered into rock. And I don't know, sometimes we could find a meeting of the minds. At one point, I actually took my boys to a recital of, it was the D.C. National Symphony. They did The Rite of Spring. And they actually liked it. Okay, the rhythms are incredible, and the notes are shocking. And I was glad to see that you could get somewhere with them. I also took them to see the Valkyrie. Because everybody wants to go around in a helmet and sing Toyota Ho. Well, all my children did. So we had some successes in that area, but mostly we had to give up in the fight against that kind of popular culture. However, I think it's important to confess. I hope this doesn't sound boastful, but all of the children I raised, she and I raised in the dismal decade of the 70s and the hopped-up decade of the 80s and the 90s, they're all still in the church. Yeah. So I'm going to stop there.
Could I jump in? I would add something. I would add something to. I mean, I have my own, the mother's perspective, of course, but I think apropos of the last point, I think a great reason for that last blessing is Holy Transfiguration Church in McLean, because we became Melkites, and we at one point lived in Springfield, Virginia. We lived in Gaithersburg, Maryland, and then we lived in Front Royal, Virginia. And we went to Holy Transfiguration, and we kept going to Holy Transfiguration. Started out 14 miles, and it became 70 miles, but it was worth it. Holy Transfiguration was really the anchor of our life. And Father Joe Francavilla, may he rest in peace, was the pastor there for 50 years. And I know that doesn't always work, and being Eastern Rite, being Melkite Greek Catholic, it has different canon law, so he could do it. But it worked so well because he knew everybody, and he had a relationship with every kid in that parish, and they felt like they belonged. And he preached every Sunday from the fathers, as you know, from the scripture and the fathers. And sitting and listening to his homilies, you just learned and you just internalized the whole package. And so that was a very important factor because, you know, it was important to us. We made it important to them. I remember, and Father Joe had services every night during Lent. And, you know, we would pack the kids into their bunny suits, their pajamas, and, you know, take them down there, and they'd fall asleep on the floor listening to the service, and then, you know. But it was life. It was an integral part of life, and that was uncountably important. The kids went through their adolescent rebellion, some worse than others. I named our first son Pierce, who was the leader of the 1916 uprising in Dublin, and I should have known better than to name somebody after a world-class rebel, because that's what we got. And one of the most gratifying moments of my life, though, was a letter I received from him when he was in boot camp in the Marines. And he writes this letter saying, "Mom, thank you for not letting us watch all those movies. Thank you for making us go to church. Thank you for not letting us do this. Thank you for not letting us do that," because the penny had finally dropped. I think Maria Montessori said that the brain sort of shuts down from about age 12 to 19, and I think she was onto something. But how balance? What's that? At different points, it was different. We were very, very fortunate that my mom moved to Virginia so she could have the kids during the week. The daycare issues at the beginning, that was always tricky, finding someplace. And she came out, and so they stayed with her during the week. And that was a real, real blessing. Sort of. I mean, she let them watch TV that we wouldn't have approved of, but other than that, they were safe. The balance was that some things just got by the side. I mean, I really didn't have the bandwidth to worry about what the house looked like. It wasn't worth the energy. You know, what the kids were thinking, what they were saying, what they were eating, that was important. You know, what the house looked like, who cares? It was on, yeah.
Sentiments to which every bosom returns an echo.
And once, Paul Weyrich was a pioneer because baby number 3, I was at that point executive vice president. No, that wasn't until baby number 4. Anyhow, I was very involved, and he was progressive, really progressive. And he said he dedicated an empty room in the building and said, "This can be the nursery, and just bring the baby to work." And that was really very forward of him. Most people weren't doing that then. It didn't work out too well, but it didn't work out too well because the baby didn't live too long. That was the problem. But the idea was very progressive. He let me, after that, when I said, "Hey, I've got to spend more time with my kids," he let me work from home. And and that was before computers. And every day somebody had to bring my mail to me, and I would send it back, and had a phone system where there was a line. You'd call the office, and you'd think you were talking to me, but in fact, my secretary had patched you through, so it rang at home. So it was complicated, but always striving to get that balance, to integrate the two. And when he got deep into Cajetan, by then the kids were a little bit older, but he had his office at home, so he would come home and disappear into the 15th century, but he'd be there.
Well, thank both of you so much, and thank you everyone for coming. I think we Have just a few minutes here. If there's a mic, to pass it around for a couple questions from the audience.
Hello.
Just keep in mind they should be actual questions, not manifestos, rants,
Okay.
proposals of
Don't worry.
marriage, whatever.
It's okay. I have two questions. I'm not actually Catholic. I'm Orthodox, but same rite. You went to an Eastern Rite church. Did you ever meet Phyllis Schlafly? Oh, okay.
Indeed, yes.
And quick second question. This is the spicy one. How much did liberation theology influence like the sentiment of the ideology of Catholics? I know I learned about it in like Latin America, but like how did it influence it in the U.S.?
Oh, well, that's a question for you.
Right. The book.
Microphone to your mouth.
I'm sorry. The book by Gonzalo Gutierrez did a great deal of damage. It was an attempt to build on developments in Catholic theology in the 50s and the 60s to find a path from traditional theology to this revolutionary ideology. And it persuaded a number of people. Many of them worked not far from here in the building that houses so many bishops. Anyway, it was an interesting book. I'm delighted that it met sharp critics, and I'm also delighted that the failure of Allende in Chile it chilled the enthusiasm for liberation theology.
Over there.
Testing. Okay. I have a quick question for both of you. In my reading of Triumph, there's always been one article that sort of stuck with me, which was a question that you posed to a group of people in the pro-life movement about not pushing anymore the Human Life Amendment and instead pushing towards the States' Rights Amendment. And what sort of struck me is how, other than one person half-heartedly, all of them vehemently rejected supporting the states' rights approach. Do you think it's been a mistake for the pro-life movement to have really, since the 80s, have adopted that view and really not push the Human Life Amendment anymore?
And no, I don't think that was a mistake at all. I think that a modest amendment that could be passed was the right thing to seek. The so-called Paramount Amendment, or the Personhood Amendment, which many right-to-life leaders championed, was never a real possibility. And it's terrible, but that was the political reality. We were slow to wake up to it. But yes, it would have been nice, of course, to have a substantive amendment that would have protected the personhood of the unborn and lots of other good things. But it wasn't about to happen. Not in American politics as it was in those days. And today, it also looks very dim, but I think that the far left of the anti-life movement has revealed more than it ever wanted to reveal. I think everyone can see now how radical Planned Parenthood has become. So I'm hoping that we can make some progress against their current monopoly of political power.
And I pretty much I second his opinion. It was always a temptation, and I think it still is, to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And the pro-life movement was particularly prone to letting that happen. And that was...
Well,
Behind the yellow lane.
How would you compare the importance of the transgender movement to the pro-life movement?
That's a huge risk now to the pro-life movement. The pro-life movement managed to keep contraception separate from abortion, and that was part of its success. I don't know how it's going to go on that question. I don't know if they can keep the whole gender thing separate because of the people who are fighting the pro-life fight. It's going to be very hard for them to keep it separate. You want to add to that?
Yes, I think that once again the left is shooting itself in the foot. They have insisted on supporting all of this surgery to mutilate children in the name of freedom of gender identity. And I think that even the average American voter understands that you don't sterilize your own children. You don't castrate your own children. And so I'm hoping that everybody can see now how ugly that gender movement is. So let's hope.
If I can just bounce back a couple of minutes in the conversation here and go back to the women's issue question, the question about Phyllis Schlafly. There is a women's movement today, but it doesn't call itself that. I mean, if you look at who basically is leading the pro-life movement on the ground and in Washington, it's women. Who's leading the Moms for Liberty to take a close look at public schools? Who have been the leaders of the homeschool movement? Who is leading the campaign to clean up school boards? Who's looking at public libraries? Those are women. And they haven't got a national leader, which is not a bad thing, because if you have one national leader, then it's easy to shoot one national leader down, figuratively or otherwise. So there is a women's movement, and it's much more closer to home, and it's much more local. I remember Mao Zedong said at one point, give me the countryside, and I'll take over the country. So I can hope, and the one bright sign of optimism right now in the world of public policy is that the grassroots are really waking up like never before on these education and family issues, and those are women's issues. And it's unfortunate that those women aren't full-time at home like they would like to be, and they have to have jobs, so they haven't got the time available that women did in Phyllis Schlafly's day, so they can't do the same thing. But that is a women's movement, and that's very powerful, and that's a bright sign.
all right. Well, thank you again all so much for coming. We can continue the conversation here at our brief reception and also check on the score of the Lions-Chiefs game. Thank you all. One more round of applause.